Over the course of human history, countless lives have come and gone, the vast majority of them only moving the needle in one or more directions at a very, very small scale. However, every now and then, once in a blue moon, we get a person or people who, for better or for worse, through their hard work and determination, and perhaps a stroke of luck of being born at the right place at the right time, ended up creating a special sort of synergy. And while it is certainly true that individual greatness, for better or for worse, is not the only factor that changes the course of history, it is nonetheless one of the most self-evident. And the Middle Ages are no exception. In this video, we're going to be going over all the people who I believe were the most influential figures of the Middle Ages. Those who have had the most impact, that still have ripples to this day, and most likely will have an impact long after we're all dead. Just for your information, I will be discussing the time period from the collapse of the Western Roman Empire to the collapse of the Eastern Roman Empire. I understand that this definition of the Middle Ages is a little bit centered around Europe, and to a lesser extent the Middle East and North Africa, and perhaps ignores those other elements of history in other parts of the world. But nonetheless, it's a pretty good working definition to understand this period of time. The time in the middle between the ancient world and the modern world, the Middle Ages. So, first on the list is Alaric. Since I'm starting off with the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, I will start with Alaric I, who was the king of the Visigoths. Visigoths meaning Western Goths. And if you're wondering what a Goth means, I'm not referring to the people from the 80s who thought they were really cool for being very pale and using excessive eyeliner, nor am I talking about a medieval style of French architecture. I'm talking about a Germanic people group. The Goths were a peoples who were pushed out by conflicts stemming from violent interactions with other Germanic tribes, as well as the Huns, who are Eurasian steppe people. The large number of Germanic barbarians across the Roman Empire heavily weakened the western half in particular, and overall, the western half was by and large poorer and weaker overall, so this made them particularly susceptible. As a result of this, the Visigoths, led by Alaric and others, were able to fill up the void by invading the Western Roman Empire and eventually sacking Rome. The sacking of Rome was not just a military defeat, it was psychologically damaging. Rome was viewed as the center of the world, and to have Rome sacked was just baffling to anybody who was living a few centuries prior. Nonetheless, while the barbarians did indeed sack the city and destroy a bunch of pretty monuments, it doesn't mean that Rome was destroyed completely. After all, it still exists today. The Roman Catholic Church would eventually rise up and become one of the major powers of the Middle Ages. This was essential as Western Europe became rather decentralized under a feudalist system. The same was not true for the Eastern Roman Empire. And that leads us to the next person on this list, or actually two people on this list that I'm going to tie together, King Justinian and his wife Theodora. As I stated before, it was only the Western Roman Empire that collapsed during this time period. The Eastern Roman Empire still thrived. This empire had survived for another 1,000 years. The most famous figure or figures would be a power couple, Justinian and Theodora. While reigning from Constantinople, founded by Constantine, the man who made Christianity the quasi-official religion of the Roman Empire, in typical Roman fashion, Justinian thought that these Germanic barbarians were nothing more than backward people, only fit to be mercenaries or raiders. So they started the reconquest of the Western Roman Empire. This was quasi-successful. Justinian took up much of North Africa from the Vandals, and he had some success against the Ostrogoths, along with a reconquest of much of the Adriatic Sea. And from this high point in what is now Turkey, he eventually managed to take over parts of what are now Spain, which is a pretty impressive feat in and of itself. Part of the reason for this success is that there was a great deal of centralization that existed in the Eastern Roman Empire. You didn't see any competition or breakdown into feudalism as you did in the Western Roman Empire. This allowed for a combination of political conditions to be linked hand in hand with the spread of Orthodox Christianity. This also led to the continued dominance of Greek culture in much of the Eastern Mediterranean. However, his grandest ambition was eventually thwarted due to clashes with the Persians of the East. These clashes between the Orthodox Christian Romans and the Eastern Zoroastrian Persians would continue to be a recurring issue for several hundred years, until another major religion would hit the scene. However, Justinian's greatest accomplishment, if you could call it that, was not so much his conquests or his laws or policies, but the Hagia Sophia, a gigantic church which is now a mosque in Istanbul. We'll get to that at the end of the video. And that leads us to another major figure that you almost certainly have heard of, and that is the Prophet Muhammad. He needs no introduction. He lived in what is today's Saudi Arabia, born in the city of Mecca. He was illiterate, but he interacted with not only pre-Islamic Arabian polytheists, but also a great deal of Jews and Christians. This gave him some interaction with monotheism. Muhammad believed himself to be the next and final prophet in a long sequence of prophets from Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, Elijah, Jesus, and then himself. However, he did make some changes to the stories. For example, instead of following the lineage of Isaac, who was a son of Abraham, Muhammad claimed to be the descendant of Ishmael, Abraham's other son. While Isaac was the father of the Jewish people, Ishmael was seen to be the father of the Arabs, coming from Abraham and his Egyptian slave Hagar. As a result of this, Muhammad and his religion Islam are considered to be Abrahamic. They follow the Abrahamic tradition along with Judaism and Christianity, as all three are monotheistic. However, the Prophet Muhammad did incorporate many aspects of polytheistic beliefs that were common in pre-Islamic Arabia. However, we don't know too much about these beliefs and practices since Muslims destroyed them, considering them to be part of the quote-unquote age of ignorance. Eventually, the Quran, along with supplementary texts like the Hadiths, would be the core source of what Muslims associate with the Prophet Muhammad and his life and teachings. What makes Muhammad fairly unique among religious figures is that he was also a significant political figure. Jesus, Buddha, and many other prophets and religious founders never had any true political power, but Muhammad did acquire political and military power, eventually conquering much of the Arabian Peninsula. This leads us to the next group of people on our list, the Rashiduns, or the Wise Ones. These would be the next four people: Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali. They would solidify the Islamic texts and teachings under one set of consecutive rules and expand Muhammad's conquests even further. The first Rashidun, Abu Bakr, would initiate the first set of clashes with the aforementioned Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire and the Zoroastrian Persian Empire. At this point, these two empires were fighting each other for so long that they were grinding each other into a pulp, which made it quite easier for the Rashiduns to take advantage of the situation. The rapid conquest of land of what was once two mighty empires by a bunch of Bedouins amplified the Islamic message. Umar continued the conquest with remarkable success, making both the Eastern Roman Empire and the Persian Empire shells of their former selves. He managed to grant some degree of relative leniency to the people of the book, namely the Jews and Christians. However, he was eventually assassinated. The next Rashidun was Uthman. This is where we get into more controversial territory, as he is known for compiling a standardized version of the Quran that most Muslims read today. But by and large, there are around 10 different versions of the text, and solidifying them into one cohesive text created a great deal of internal problems for the Islamic doctrine. In part of this, and as a result of this, he was eventually assassinated. The last and most controversial of the Rashiduns was Ali, who was the cousin of the son-in-law of Muhammad. He was quasi-related to the Prophet Muhammad, and he by and large was considered by some to be the main successor, not Abu Bakr, but alas, this didn't initially happen. Ali would eventually take the reins of power, however not without a battle between those who did not want Islam to spread through a hereditary monarchy, and those who did. Ali eventually was defeated by those who were opposed to hereditary rule at the Battle of the Camels. This is seen as the beginning of the Shia-Sunni divide that still exists to this day. And while it is true that many Sunnis do revere Ali, they don't revere him to the same extent that the Shia have. On top of that, this squabbling would lead to an end of the Rashiduns and the beginning of the Umayyad Caliphates, who would usher in an age of Islam at its height, despite the fractures that existed just prior to that. The third Rashidun Uthman actually was a member of the clan of the Umayyads, who would eventually take control of the Islamic world and take it to its furthest extent, stretching from what is now Portugal to what is now India. Now next on the list goes back to Christian Europe. You may have heard of him. His name is Charlemagne. And no, I'm not talking about the rapper, I'm talking about the medieval nobleman. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire created a power vacuum in which countless squabbling kings, nobles, and lords were fighting over territory. What would eventually come about from this power vacuum and chaos would be partially resolved by the Roman Empire. Not your typical Roman Empire or Roman emperor, but rather a barbarian from the people groups known as the Franks. And that man in particular was Charlemagne. He would be the most powerful man in Western Europe after the fall of the Caesars, and would found the Carolingian dynasty. At this point, with enough interactions with Rome, many of these Germanic people groups like the Franks eventually converted to Christianity and abandoned some of their Germanic pagan ways. Charlemagne would build up educational institutions, in part to spread Christianity, but he was also quite fond of using mass violence to spread the religion as well, given his massacre of Verdun against the Saxons. And while he was indeed bloody, these conquests did eventually create a foundation of what would be Christian Europe. And that also set the stages for the modern states of France and Germany itself. While Charlemagne died, his kingdom was split into 3 different kingdoms among his sons. Many have argued that this middle kingdom between what is now Germany and France would lead to a long series of conflicts between the 2 countries. Next on the list is Harun al-Rashid. Harun al-Rashid was actually Charlemagne's quasi-pen pal, if you could call him that. He was the leader, or one of the leaders, of the Abbasid Caliphate, which eventually took over from the Umayyad Caliphate. His reign marks what we now refer to as the Islamic Golden Age. This would take place in the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, the greatest center of learning in the Middle Ages. Speaking of books, many of his tales, real and exaggerated, have been added to the 1001 Arabian Nights, also known as the 1001 Nights. The title varies depending on the publisher. To give you an idea of how advanced his reign was, Charlemagne had sent Frankish emissaries to visit Harun al-Rashid. The leader of the Islamic Golden Age had given them a number of items, including a brass clock. The clock was so advanced and sophisticated that the Franks thought it was witchcraft. So let's move on to Alfred the Great. The Viking invasions had left much of northwestern Europe in shambles, and many people among the British Islanders were looking for a powerful leader to fight back. One of those figures was Alfred the Great. See, at the time, Britain was mostly populated by Saxons and Angles, Germanic people groups who had migrated around the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. This was followed by a series of Viking invasions at the hands of the Norsemen, from what are now Norway and Denmark. The people from Denmark were usually called the Danes, as you could probably tell. Alfred would allow many of them to settle down and farm under the Danelaw. However, they had to convert to Christianity, and in most cases, Alfred the Great would eventually take back much of the political and cultural power and give it to the Anglos and Saxons, or the Anglo-Saxons. Alfred the Great would also retake London. He also instituted educational reforms and set up the foundations of what would later become the country of England, arguably the most influential country in the modern world. This was followed by another major figure of the British Isles by the name of William the Conqueror. William the Conqueror was a descendant of a Viking called Rollo, who had settled down in Normandy in northern France. Normandy comes from the word Norman, which refers to the Norsemen or Norway. A few generations down the line, William the Bastard would eventually sail across the strait to what is now England, and at the Battle of Hastings defeat the Saxons. This would be the last and arguably most consequential conquest of what is now the British Isles. This resulted in a Frankification by the Vikings to the island of Britain. This is the reason why the English language, while being Germanic, has many Latin roots, primarily through French. While the Romans didn't really have much of an impact on Britain, the Normans and their French-speaking ways certainly did. And this is part of the reason why English is such a bizarre language. Granted, it would take several generations to fully wrest control over what is now England. Nonetheless, there's a reason why the kings and queens of England today have names like William and Edward rather than Athelstan and Aethelwulf. Eventually, the story of England would merge with the story of the Islamic world in the Middle East. This leads us to the next major figure on our list, Saladin, arguably the most famous Middle Eastern person from the Middle Ages after Muhammad. Unlike most figures of the time, he was not Arab, he was Kurdish. However, he also hailed from Egypt, even though most Kurds today, generally speaking, come from what is now Iraq, Turkey, and Iran. At this point in time, the Muslim world was far more diversified and advanced than it was at the time of Muhammad, no longer simply dominated by Arabs, as there were various people groups who the Arabs reigned over, namely the Turks, who had eventually settled down in the Middle East and converted to Islam, becoming the dominant group. This would lead to a great deal of cultural synergy. However, there was also a lack of unity, with not only ethnic divisions but also Sunni-Shia divisions. At this point, Islam was far more widespread, but also more diffuse. Through military conquest and more importantly very skilled political maneuvering, Saladin took control of a complex situation and abolished the Fatimid dynasty in Egypt. And he created the Ubayyid dynasty, which would reaffirm Sunni Islam's dominance in the Muslim world over the Fatimid Shia dominance. Nonetheless, he was able to unify various Muslim factions to fight the Crusaders, regardless of whether they were Sunni or Shiite. This led to the most famous crusade, the Third Crusade. The Christian side was by and large led by Richard the Lionheart of England. The Third Crusade ended up not being a complete victory of either side, but rather a truce. While the Christians did not regain possession of the holy city of Jerusalem permanently, Saladin did allow some tolerant policies to allow Christian pilgrims to enter the city unharmed. As a result of this, Saladin and Richard the Lionheart have been seen as a sort of epic and romanticized tale of two historical figures that were arch enemies who eventually came to a peaceful treaty. Next on the list is Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi. Unlike many of the figures I've named in this video, he was not political or a member of the military, but rather a mathematician. As I pointed out before, the Baghdad House of Wisdom was the greatest center of learning at the time, including studies such as astronomy, geography, and mathematics. He had laid out the foundations for algebra, which simplified our understanding of the value of the unknown, splitting things between unknown variables and known variables, using the known variables to figure out the unknown variable. His name is where you get the term algorithm from. By the way, the Baghdad House of Wisdom was home to plenty of other geniuses, coming from all over the world, including the Indian subcontinent, where they had developed the decimal system and the number 0, which eventually would be incorporated by Middle Eastern peoples and later by Europeans. Next on the list is going back to the British Isles, and we arrive at a guy you may have heard of called King John of England. Now, King John of England wasn't necessarily a great king, to be honest, and he honestly was kind of a lousy king, if you could call him that, but he was most famous for being forced to sign the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta signed into law that the crown could no longer persecute either the nobility or the church to any serious degree. For example, nobles could not just be arrested and thrown to prison without an actual trial. Increases in taxation or fees would have to go through an actual standardized political process rather than being based upon the whims of whatever the king wanted. Protections for ordinary citizens were not included. And there was a great deal of anti-Catholic bigotry as well, unfortunately. Nonetheless, the Magna Carta still solidified a series of rights for people groups who did not fall directly under the hands of the crown's ownership. Now, to be clear, the Magna Carta isn't quite as groundbreaking as some people in the past have made it out to be. There were several other forms of proto-constitutional law that eventually set the foundations of British common law. Nonetheless, the sort of mythology that revolves around the Magna Carta eventually led to the founders of the United States using it as an inspiration for the American Constitution, and would eventually usher in an age of democracy and constitutional law around much of the developed world. So let's move on to the part of the world that hasn't seen too much democracy as of late, but did accomplish quite a lot back in the day, the Middle East, namely through Ibn Battuta. Ibn Battuta was from what is now Morocco. While he wasn't a political figure, he was probably the most well-traveled person before the invention of the engine. It's difficult to tell to what extent his tales actually happened and how much of it was just BS. However, the scope and area that he traveled is quite astonishing, even if it is exaggerated. Much of North Africa, West Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, Asia Minor, Persia, parts of Europe, parts of Central Asia, and the Indian subcontinent, and maybe just maybe China and Southeast Asia. At this time, it was an incredibly astonishing feat, and would mark the beginnings of a global system of trade along the Silk Road. Next on the list is someone you almost certainly have heard of, and that man's name is Genghis Khan. Mongolia at the time was a backwater. It has harsh summers, frigid winters, low precipitation, poor soil quality, and was basically an environment that only the toughest of the tough nomadic people could survive in. Through smart political maneuvering, and namely the use of meritocracy over excess nepotism, as well as a handful of brilliant military tactics, Genghis Khan was able to unite the various Mongolian tribes, who had been by and large hardened by the harsh climate and by fighting each other. The first target of this united group of Mongols would be China, followed by much of Central Asia and Persia, with many of his generals pushing into Korea, Asia Minor, and what is now Russia and Ukraine. The amount of destruction and bloodshed caused by these conquests is unfathomable. However, many modern historians have the habit of downplaying just how terrible these conquests were. The steppe cultures and the Mongols specifically were renowned for their ability to sack as many cities as possible, from Beijing to Kiev. And even though Genghis Khan didn't partake in every single one of these conquests, he certainly set the motion of a series of events that would eventually result in the destruction of many kingdoms and the spread of the Black Death. To be fair, the Mongols were fairly tolerant rulers after they had conquered you, as they allowed various people to practice their religions, and by and large keep some of their culture intact so long as they were paying extortion fees. Next on the list is Hulagu Khan, of which I'm butchering the pronunciation of. This was one of Genghis Khan's grandchildren. He is well known for invading much of the Middle East and eventually defeating Baghdad, centered around the Abbasid Caliphate, the center of learning, the center of Islamic civilization, which was eventually burned to the ground by the Mongols, thus ending Islam's dominance over world history. Less brutal was the reign of Kublai Khan, the next person on this list. As stated before, the Mongol Empire basically broke up into various pieces after Genghis Khan. One ruled what is now Russia and Ukraine, another what is now Iran and Asia Minor, or Turkey, another in Central Asia, and another around East Asia. Kublai Khan would eventually take control of the Mongol territories in East Asia in what is now China. While his reign oftentimes involved numerous military expeditions to crush rebellions, it's worth noting that he wasn't simply a bloodthirsty conqueror like many of his Mongolian steppe predecessors. He had set up a complex bureaucracy and a system of trade networks. He invested in science, technology, art, and culture. His infrastructure projects, such as rebuilding the Grand Canal, among other colossal feats, proved to be very groundbreaking. He also practiced religious tolerance, at least by the standards of his time, and he also got cartographers to map out the Silk Road. While Kublai Khan was probably the most benevolent of Eurasian steppe lords, the worst guy on the list is yet to come, and his name is Tamerlane. He would eventually take up control of much of Central Asia and what is now Iran, converting to Islam. However, he was quite fond of killing other Muslims. See, around this time you saw weird synergy between Turkic people and Iranian people, or Iranic people, who mixed with Mongolians into a strange cultural synergy along the steppes. Now, all three of these people groups loved fighting each other, but they also liked uniting against other people to fight against. This had led to an outburst of intense violence along the Eurasian steppes and depopulation. Tamerlane, by and large, is seen as the great mass murderer of the steppe lords, and perhaps the last great mass murderer of the steppe, if you could call him that. Eventually, with the invention of gunpowder, much of the cavalry techniques used by these people became obsolete, and much of the lands would be eventually taken over by the modern states of Russia, China, Iran, and Turkey. Next up on the list is someone you have almost certainly heard about, but probably don't know too much about, and that is Joan of Arc. At this time, we're dealing with the High Middle Ages. The second half of the Middle Ages weren't quite as dark as the past, and you started to see the formation of some sort of proto-national identities, the most important one being France. Now, as I mentioned before, the history of England and France are deeply interwoven given the Norman conquests, as the Normans were from northern France, in what is called Normandy. It wasn't called France at the time, but you get what I'm saying. They would eventually conquer England, and the two countries would kind of be interwoven together if you could even call them countries. However, there were clear divides. The king centered in England still owned a great deal of swath of land in what is now known as France, and the French were not too happy with it. This would result in the 100 Years' War, which wasn't really a 100 Years' War, but a series of wars confined roughly within a period of a century. This saw the rise of Joan of Arc, becoming the patron saint of France and one of history's most iconic women. And while it's true that the 100 Years' War is far more broad of a topic that goes well beyond her life, her iconography ended up creating a certain sense of shared identity for the burgeoning French movement, which would eventually morph into the nation-state of France, one of the most influential of all time. To the south, you had the Italian peninsula, and in the city of Florence, you had the Medicis. The Medici family would become one of the most powerful in the world, or at least on the continent. Europe by this point was no longer a massive backwater, and there were the beginnings of the rise of modernity. And no place better encapsulated this than Florence. The Medicis would set up the first major bank in Florence, with complex financial instruments that were not available at the time beforehand. Today, many people take issue with the influence that banking and financial systems have on modern-day politics, and this was the case during the period of the Medici's heyday. In many ways, it may have even started the trend. No longer was power dominated simply by generals or politicians or kings. Now financiers and businessmen played a significant role. This had massive power projections in the future. One of the most groundbreaking inventions they created was their bookkeeping system, in which you have a bank account with a series of credits and debits. Every time you open up your bank account, for better or for worse, you have the Medicis to thank for this. The last person on the list is Mehmet the Conqueror. As stated before, many historians consider the Middle Ages to be a time period between the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire, at least as far as Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa are concerned. While Alaric may have sprung the beginnings of the Middle Ages by sacking Rome in the western half, the Eastern Roman Empire, which had existed for nearly a millennia longer, collapsed as well, this time at the hands of the Ottoman Turks, an Islamic empire that would slowly but surely be chipping away at the Byzantines, eventually conquering Constantinople and defeating the last Roman emperor. This is the reason why the Hagia Sophia that I mentioned previously, that was built under Justinian's reign, is no longer a church, but rather a mosque. And the Ottoman Empire would eventually become one of the longest-running empires in world history, and the last great Muslim empire before its defeat at the collapse at the end of World War I. And there you have it. That is my list of some of the most influential people of the Middle Ages. If you have any others that you'd like to add to the list, please tell me, as there are certainly many others that are worthy of a mention. Anyway, thanks for watching.